And time after time, his films show bourgeois life threatened by otherness that disturbs its private spaces. Carl Schmitt has this lovely summary of Hegel's definition of the bourgeois subject. He says, the bourgeois is an individual who does not want to leave the apolitical, riskless, private sphere. He rests in the possession of his private property, and under the justification of his possessive individualism, he acts as an individual against the totality. He is the man who finds his compensation for his political nullity in the fruits of freedom and enrichment, and above all, in the total security of its use. Consequently, he wants to be spared bravery and exempted from the danger of a violent death. You can see this in the way that the film dramatizes its themes over this tale of home invasion, with Georges and Anne struggling to maintain the integrity of their home, even though their home has not been physically attacked. Instead, it's been assailed by images and surveillance. And this is backed up by Elizabeth Ezra and Jane Sillar's discussion of the film, where they say that Cachet forces us to think about what we allow inside and what we insist remains outside, the ways we psychologically, physically, and legislatively construct and imagine the idea of home. What does it mean to construct a home as a place of safety, a refuge that shuts out the world, the past? What happens on an individual and political level when we invest in the paranoid fantasy of home as a fortress? And I'd invite you to analyse the mise en scène, that is, the staging, the design of shots like this. This is Georges in his TV studio, where he runs a TV show on literary criticism. Notice the rows of books. We can't see their titles. They may not even be real books. They may just be set dressing. But notice the similarity between home and work, the windowless spaces in which he spends his time. This is, again, not a realist aesthetic. The sets have been designed quite realistically, but also there's an expressionistic angle to this where they're conveying something about his character through this deployment of books as a wall and a defence. We don't see windows in their apartment. The only kind of gap in their armour is the television. And we are, I bet you, supposed to notice the irony in this shot where they're having a conversation and the TV in the dead centre of the frame is showing you news footage of violence in the Middle East, decontextualised and just, occupying that central space in the frame and yet being ignored. This is not subtle imagery. These are not subtle connections that he's asking you to draw. Georges' problem is often about how to distinguish between threats and environment. We can see that he treats his privacy as sovereign, despite having a very high-profile media job, and he's built his home environment around that kind of protection. The paradox of television in a shot like this is that it seems like we use it to look out upon the world from a position of safety. The tapes that they receive seem designed to remind Georges of the responsibilities on both sides to respond, to interpret and analyse what we see. So this is all about Georges' requirement to analyse the tapes, follow the clues, even though he doesn't always make the leap to acknowledging his own complicity in them. It might also be notable that when Georges hides after Magid's death, he goes to the cinema. Again, he's hiding with images. What does he go and see? Do we know what he goes and sees? Well, we don't know for certain, but we can see the posters offering him choices. He can go and see Ma Mère, or My Mother, in which Isabelle Huppert, another actress from an earlier Haneke film. How shall I put this? The film concludes with her acknowledging her son's sexual attraction to her by cutting open her womb and inviting him to re-enter. Well, it actually finishes with him masturbating over her corpse, shall we say. Or he could have gone to see Two Brothers, if that was too much. Two Brothers, a French film about two tiger cubs. That's much safer, isn't it? Two tiger cubs. What's the story? What happens to these two tiger cubs? They're separated as children. They're put into different environments and they grow up to hate each other. and finally meet for a battle to the death at the end. Is there a parallel there with the story between Majid and Georges? Or he could go and see Bad Education, the Pedro Almodovar film, which is at least in part about the sexual abuse of children. So, really loaded choices there, which may have even more resonance for Georges. He's constantly surrounded by images which are reminding him of his situation. They live in a place that is protected by simulation, but once the tapes start to arrive, those simulations, we might see them as fighting back. So the tapes are an intervention into that circuit that force Georges to interpret and act upon what he sees. So we might see this as Haneke's own intervention in what he sees as our passive acceptance of the images that unfold on our TV and cinema screens. We've been led to attach certain formal properties of moving image media to truth. That opening shot, again, has a fixed framing. It's an unedited, long take. So we might be expected to, attach an objective sense of veracity to this kind of image. We like to think that surveillance footage, which this undoubtedly resembles, is objective and does reveal truths to us by the very fact that it's come from a mechanical medium which makes no artistic intervention in what has been seen and therefore records objectively. This is you may have heard of André Bazin's notion of filmic realism and how it is protected and preserved by the use of long takes, by fixed camera framing, which allows you control over the image. You can look wherever you want within the frame. It hasn't been carved up by editing for you to kind of force you to look in a certain way or to interpret the sequence in a certain way. We might also note how we're asked to look at the formal properties of video footage. The fact that the videotapes are sent to them and we see their material qualities, such as the snow on the screen or the rewinding of the tape, it's supposed to look a little bit like home video, and yet it's been twisted for us into something far more threatening. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead to talk about a couple of other Haneke films. I was going to have a little aside about how he might have been referencing the Al-Qaeda death videos, which he's alluded to as a kind of particularly modern phenomenon, that the decapitation of hostages was one thing, but the obscenity that media responded to was the videoing of it, the reduction of death footage to the status of a lolcat. They were very consciously designed so that once they're on the internet, they're degraded and reduced to the lowly status of just other images. But that may be a connection that you'd like to draw. How his engagement with visual media sits alongside what we see as a kind of culture of ubiquitous imagery. There's something very old-fashioned about Haneke's version of media and the way he describes it as this passive thing. He doesn't really engage with new media or the internet in any detailed way. So how about his other films? He has been preoccupied with death and violence quite a lot. In Cachet, there's specifically a series of references to cut throats. I think there's a pun intended on the similarity between to cut, as in with a knife, and to cut, as in to edit. And I'm afraid that is a real chicken laying down its life for your movie viewing pleasure. And more than one critic has noted Haneke's tendency to kill animals in his movies. He's not a vegan's filmmaker. So another question might be, why does he do this? Why does he like to focus on violence so much, especially that unsimulated violence, which kind of breaks our comfort zone and our expectation that everything we see will be fabricated and nothing actually gets hurt. But I want you to note a tendency in my plot descriptions of some of his other films. In The Seventh Continent from 1989, he shows us the story, apparently based loosely on truth, of a middle-class family who commit mass suicide. Apart from some illusions that they're a bit disillusioned with the state of modern life and its dehumanizing effects There's nothing particularly striking about the family, and we're never given a satisfactory explanation of why they all decide to kill themselves. In Benny's video, we see a young boy who engages with the world mostly by watching it on video. One particular video, which is of a pig being slaughtered. He watches this repeatedly and in slow motion, and eventually he becomes a murderer and has no real sense that he's done anything wrong. The obvious insinuation being here that the media is what made him do it. It's a very simple and simplistic connection that is drawn. But more importantly, we have his parents protecting him from the authorities because they feel culpable for giving him all of this this video equipment in the first place. In Funny Games, a middle-class family is terrorized by a pair of young men for no apparent reason except for pleasure and perhaps subtextually class vengeance. In all of these films, as in Cachet, the names of the parents of the family are Georges and Anne, or Anna, for a minor variation. Clearly, he has his bourgeois archetypes down pat. And there is something continuous going across all of these films where he wants you to make those connections between that disjuncture between real life and recorded life. I'm going to show you a clip from the 2007 remake of Funny Games. But first I want you to notice these side-by-side comparisons between the 1997 version of the film and the 2007 American remake. When asked to remake the film, Haneke agreed on the insistence that he be allowed to shoot every single shot exactly the same. Lay any of the shots right next to each other and you'll find this level of repetition. And it really is extraordinary how carefully this has been composed, even though the films are made 10 years apart. What? Why? Why does he want to do this? Well, his argument is that there was nothing wrong with the film, but it wasn't seen by American audiences. And American audiences were the ones he particularly wanted to see it, because it's about passive acceptance of media violence and how it overspills into real life. So it's designed to be a kind of horror film in which a house is invaded, but it's designed to be impossible to enjoy. And so it kind of is meant to make you feel uncomfortable. And when lots of people walked out of the film's screening at Cannes in '97, his statement to the press was, well, walking out of this film is the only rational response. And if you can walk out, if you can resist the desire to know what happens next, you don't need to see this film. It's designed for those people who just have to know whether they're going to die and whether we're going to get to see them die. This sounds horribly sadistic, and indeed it is a very cruel film.